I just read that you've retired as a Beatles expose artist after 8 years of analysis. So why don't we just start there? Obviously, you're still talking about it, but you must feel that you're able to put this thing to bed. So why don't we start like 8 years ago, uh, where you were at and how it all began?
I did retire the ongoing day in and day out research back last November. So it started, just to begin by letting the audience know, Jason, that I was a huge Beatle freak. As a kid and growing up, the Beatles are the reason why I picked up a guitar. They're the reason why I wrote my own music. It's the reason why I recorded my own music. That clicked along for a very long time.
Right. I'm interested actually in the minutiae here. You're obviously probably about my age or something like that. So the Beatles were disbanded by the time you got into them. What was your entry point to the Beatles?
1968 when Yellow Submarine came out. So they were still a band. I was bugging my parents to take me to go see the film when I was a kid. I was 9 years old. I'm 66 years old.
Yeah. You're younger than you look then.
I
Right.
was born in 59.
Right.
And so I bugged them and bugged them. And my brother, who was 14 months younger than I am, he was also into the Beatles. So my father, I'm sure reluctantly, took us both to the movie theater to go see this crazy animation. And as a kid, I didn't realize it was an animation. I remember being disappointed until the end of the film when the Beatles themselves came out. Then it was worth the price of admission just for that 5 or 10 minutes at the end of the movie. And I knew about the Paul is Dead conspiracy. In fact, when I was in high school, I had organized a Paul is Dead talk where the brother of a friend of mine, he was 5 years older than we were, his name was Doug, and he knew all about the clues on the album covers and the backmasking and all that stuff, and I was so intrigued by it. So I organized this little lecture for Doug to come in, and I didn't think there was going to be a lot of people who were going to attend Doug's talk, but I was wrong. When it was time to start, it was standing room only in the classroom, and I remember it was very fascinating. He brought a record player in, he was playing the tracks backwards and pointing out all of the clues on the album covers. But to me, I thought that the whole Paul is Dead theory or conspiracy was nothing more than a clever and witty marketing ploy by the Beatles to engage with their fan base. I
Right.
always thought that Paul was Paul.
What year was that then that that Doug did the presentation?
Doug did the presentation in 1976.
So it had been around for 7 years, the Paul is Dead
Right,
theory. Yeah.
right.
Wow. It still had legs.
It still had legs, especially amongst the Beatle fans, the Beatle freaks. I considered myself to be a Beatle freak. At one time, I had so much Beatle memorabilia that my brother would come to my house and say it was a Beatle shrine. And I had everything. I got rid of a lot of stuff, even my vinyl collection. I had a vinyl collection of Beatle records from across the world that would rival anybody's collection of Beatle vinyl. And over the last year, I sold off approximately 75% of it just to clear things out because having done the research, I now know, I'm not even going to say that I believe, I now know that the Beatles were not what we were told that they were. And so what happened was I clicked along, still thinking that Paul was Paul. The whole Paul is Dead thing was nonsense until 2016 when I bought the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears. And that book came out in 2009. So in 2016, I was 7 years late to the party. That's when I finally caught up with the book. So I bought the book. On the Amazon site, it explains that it's historical fiction, and I just thought it was going to be an enjoyable read. I really didn't expect much out of it. I was just curious. But when I read the book, it hit me very quickly that whoever wrote this book, or wherever the source information came from, there was so much information that only somebody within the Beatles' inner circle or the person playing the part of Paul McCartney, claiming to play the part of Paul McCartney, Billy Shears, had something to do with the book. Because the amount of information about Beatle history, about songs, and all of that was just too much.
Is there a specific, because I read the book, I got it on my shelf. And frankly, I wasn't convinced, although I'm very open to the Paul is dead thing, and pretty much always have been. And I'm kind of more than half convinced on that. But something about the book didn't quite persuade me. So I'm curious, like what,
Well, tell me what it is that didn't persuade you.
well, that would take longer, I think, than what I was going to ask you. But it's something to do with the presentation overall. Like if it really was somebody who's a multimillionaire who wanted to get the truth out, I'd expect something a bit more prestigious. It just has the flavor more to me of a hoax. There seems to be, and to me, it's not either or, actually. I mean, I don't want to take up too much time with my point of view because I want to hear yours, but to me, it's not necessarily either or because I think you have the mainstream narrative, the official narrative, which has all these holes in. And then there's this other narrative, I call it the second matrix, which is also somewhat manufactured and takes elements of the truth, but creates a counter narrative. And I try and sort of slip between the two.
Yeah, by design.
Yeah.
The book is written like that by design. In the beginning of the book, I believe, if it's still in the introduction, it talks about the book being, it's not mainstream. We know this. It's self-published. And the reason why that's done actually goes right in line with what Billy is all about. So Billy is all about puzzles. He's about creating something that is not straightforward, something that's going to make people think, that's going to make people intrepid, investigate, to take it a step further. In fact, the book implies throughout the narrative, based upon the fact that it is historical fiction, it tells you that if you want to find the truth, then you're going to need to dig deeper. You're going to have to go outside the book in order to discern whether the book, what it's telling you, is fiction or whether it's nonfiction. And this is what happened with me. When I was reading the book, one of the prior editions, I don't know if it's still page 350, it was the blue-covered book, not the red. It talked about how George Martin was going to take the Beatles songs, their little songs, and make them big. I'm paraphrasing. And when I read that passage, I remember thinking to myself, that was a very strange passage because aren't Paul McCartney and John Lennon supposed to be the most prolific genius songwriters of all time in pop music? So why would George Martin have to make their little songs big? And then the next page, it goes into the Committee of 300 and the snitch. So the snitch is Dr. John Coleman, who wrote the book on the Committee of 300. And so that was an invitation by the book in a very, very subtle way to take the reader from here inside the book to outside the book in order to fill in more of the blanks.
Right.
There are passages in the book which are coy, that are cryptic, and that's by design. It's explained that the book has to retain plausible deniability because of non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, that both Tommy Harriet has signed and that Billy himself has signed to play the role of Paul McCartney. In fact, in the book, he talks about the fact that if he breaches these contracts, he could wind up in a lot of hot water as far as, especially from the perspective of his financial security and the financial security of his children, because they're going to inherit his wealth. So there's this fine line that is being walked throughout the book. The other thing about the book, the way it has been put together, it's very clever. The fiction is defined what people don't want to believe. So when the book talks about the Beatles and their connection into the ideology and the philosophy of Aleister Crowley, the Beatles as an entity, they were immersed in the occult. If somebody doesn't want to believe that the Beatles had anything to do with Aleister Crowley, then that part of the book is nonsense. It's fiction. If people don't want to believe that he played the role of Vivian Stanshall in the Bonzo Dog Band with Neil Innes, for those of you who don't know, Neil Innes was one of the main players in the band The Ruddles, which was a Beatles parody band. If you don't want to believe that, then that part of the book is fiction.
But do you think there might be things in there that some people do want to believe, but that are fiction, if you see what I mean, that make it more
it could be.
titillating, but also less credible? Because I know people who, like yourself, we've just met, but I know other people who are fully sold on the whole thing, and I know people who are utterly dismissive. I'm sure you know plenty of those too, right?
Of course.
And as I say, I definitely lean towards your interpretation. I wouldn't be talking to you otherwise, but I understand why some of these people are dismissive, because they're not just normies who are Beatles fans. They might be very learned about conspiracy, but they consider this one, a step too far.
Why do they feel that way?
Well, I think it has to do with this, that there's a narrative that's been created that seems a bit too tidy somehow. Well, I mean, when I've listened to your presentation, we'll get to it today. But what I like about what you've done is you're looking at the official narrative and just basically assembling all the inconsistencies and the anomalies that don't add up. And that's persuasive to me. However, when a narrative is generated out of that, or if it's done prematurely, then I feel that, well, maybe you've had this experience, you can lose the attention of the listener because they go, well, wait a minute, Aleister Crowley. I mean, I've done a lot of study of Aleister Crowley, so I know a lot about Crowley. I find it entirely credible the Beatles were immersed in Crowleyanity because he's everywhere.
Yep.
That Paul McCartney was Crowley's son, however, I don't buy that. I mean, it's possible, but that just sounds like it's too hard to verify.
But the book doesn't state that.
Okay, but it's in there, isn't it? It's in the sort of...
It alludes to the possibility. In fact, I've had a researcher that I'm connected into, Stacy, who found other clues encoded in the book that tied Billy's family back to the Douglas Hamilton bloodline, Scottish blue bloodline on his father's side, and his mother's side back to the Percys. And the Percys have Campbell blood. And in the book, Billy tells us that he has Campbell relatives. When you read the book, you cannot just take it at face value, which is what too many people are doing. They just want to read the narrative and say, okay, I read the book and I either believe it or I don't believe it or I don't know. That's like the three camps.
Yeah.
But the book is encoded. And I've explained it so many times on my shows that if you really want to dig in, you have to catch the points where it is encoded. Like I mentioned with my piece on the music. Most people would have read that, and I did at first too, and blew right past it about George Martin making their little songs great. But then something caught, something that pulled me in, like, hold on a second, there's something to this. And this is the same thing that Stacy did when she looked at the book and looked at other clues that were embedded and encoded, and then she took the work to the Douglas Hamiltons and the Percys as his bloodline. Here's the other thing, Jason, that I find. There's a lot of people that consider themselves to be into the alternative research. There's so many things that they will call out, and many times rightfully so. But when it gets to this, when it gets to the Beatles or it gets to the Rolling Stones, that's when they step back. Mm-hmm. Everything else can be a conspiracy. Everything else can be a deception, but not this.
Now it's Donald Trump. Now Donald Trump must be what he seems. And anyway,
yeah.
It's whatever people are emotionally invested in, of course.
The thing is, we have to keep in mind that the music industry and the entertainment industry is completely controlled. It's a major tool in the toolbox of the controllers.
I've written books about it, so I'm absolutely persuaded of that myself. I don't want to keep reiterating, but I do feel that there's also a disinformation thing, which is a kind of conspiratainment. So there's a lot of research out there, right, who dumb it down in a way that makes it sexier and more, they get more clicks, but they might also be disinfo agents who are deliberately mixing up the truth with
absolutely. That's all around us.
Yeah. Let's get to Robert Soul in a minute to lay out some of the nitty gritty, but as long as we're on this question of what we could trust and what we can't, what were you able to find out about John Coleman? Because I don't think I've ever found anything confirming that this guy was what he says he was, and so much seems to come from him as this original source that can't be checked. So were you able to verify anything around him and his claims?
All I can go by from John Coleman is the books that he's written. He's written books on the Committee of 300, on the Club of Rome, on Tavistock, on Freemasonry. When people come to me and say, well, Coleman used an alias, we don't have a definitive background on Coleman. Coleman doesn't use citations in some of his books. Like in particular, we'll talk about the Committee of 300. So my response back to folks is that read his books and tell me where he got it wrong.
That can be hard, though. I mean, if he's making claims that are completely new to you.
But if you go back, his books were written many years ago. So the Committee of 300 was written back in the early 1990s. It's 30 years ago. Read the book today. And then fast forward 30 years to today,
Yeah.
where did he miss the boat? Did he get a couple of things wrong because maybe the controllers shifted things up as far as their strategy? Yeah. But most, 90% of what he's got in that book transpired over the past 30 years. Now, somebody could say, well, that's revelation of the method and he's controlled opposition and all that stuff. But you know what? What does that have to do with the fact that those things happen? And you could have read about it 30 years ago. See, people fall back on this thing where they say they want to discount something or they want to discount somebody by saying things like they're controlled op, we don't know much about them, we don't know this, we don't know that. But there's a body of work. Just read the body of work and let that be the main driver as to whether this person has credibility. Now, I don't know. Could Coleman have been controlled opposition? He could have been. But even within controlled opposition, there's always truth.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, it's 90% truth and 10% lies is disinformation. But in this present example, a question would be, what if the 10% lies includes the Beatles Tavistock narrative? I mean, I know you've confirmed it in your own way, so we're going to get to that. But just that I have a question mark around how the narrative got started. So, right, people refer back to this, but then
I don't say that the Beatles were a creation of Tavistock because John Coleman said they were a creation of Tavistock. You have to understand Tavistock. Take John Coleman out of the equation and understand what Tavistock was all about. Understand what the Frankfurt School was all about. And then you start putting it together. And then you start to connect the dots. Now, here's the other thing, Jason. There is no direct evidence with just about any conspiracy. Because once there's direct evidence, there's no longer really a conspiracy.
Yeah.
Everything is circumstantial. But people get convicted every day in court here in the United States on a good circumstantial case. So that's the other thing I get a lot. People will say, well, where specifically does it say this? Where specifically does it say that? Well, okay, listen, it's a conspiracy. If you work for a corporation and you're in the rank and file doing your job in a cubicle every day, and upstairs they're talking about how to reduce your pay, how to take away your benefits, who's going to get laid off, there's a conspiracy taking place above your head. You don't know about it. You don't know about it until it starts to happen. Sometimes rumblings come out about what's taking place upstairs, and people will talk about it. Oh, that's just hearsay until it happens, until people lose their salaries, they lose their jobs, they lose their benefit coverage. And it's no longer a conspiracy. So it's the same thing with anything that we look at, and it's the same thing with what I did with the Beatles. Once you build a big enough case, I took the official narrative, and the official narrative has a lot of holes in it, a lot of holes in it.
Mm-hmm.
And there are cracks in the dam, and you have to start looking at the cracks and seeing if there's another narrative.
Well, let's get to some of the smoking guns, or at least the bullet shells lying around. I'm going to link to other interviews or presentations around rubber soul, so we don't have to go through all the minutiae. You don't have to do it for the 1000th time. But if you want to sum up, because there's so much of it seems to be, to me, around the circumstances of that album, just as a microcosmic example of what we're talking about. If you want to sum up what you discovered and how conclusive it ended up being for you around that period, that would be great.
Okay, so the first thing we probably should set the table with is that the Beatles were on the hook for 2 albums a year from 63 through 1966. And before we get to Rubber Soul, according to the official narrative, there was no problem with coming into the studio with music. But when we get to Rubber Soul, they come into the studio, into EMI, on October 11th of 1965 with essentially no music in the backlog. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, if they know they're on the hook for 2 albums a year, why weren't they writing songs? Especially in 1965, because unlike 63 and 64, they had more time to do that. But it didn't get done. So we'll just keep that on the back burner, because that's something that I think a lot of people miss. You have a job to do. You're responsible for a deliverable, and you're not doing it. You're not working on the deliverable. what happened was I bought a DVD, Deconstructing the Beatles, and this particular segment was about Rubber Soul. So I call it Deconstructing Rubber Soul, and the author of the series is a gentleman by the name of Scott Fryman. And Scott is a musicologist. He's very accomplished musically, and he is an expert on the Beatles. So Scott kicks off this, it's a filmed lecture is what it was, presentation. And he kicks it off by saying that the Beatles came into the Rubber Soul sessions essentially empty. They had come off a tour, their U.S. tour. They had a 6-week break after the tour. And after the 6 weeks, they entered EMI on October 11th of 65. Recording started the next day on October 12th of 1965. And they had to wrap up by November 11th of 1965. So 30 days. They had 30 days to write from scratch, learn the song. So what I mean by learn the songs is if John and or Paul write a song, they then have to take that song to George and Ringo, explain the song, play it through, get the arrangements down, the basic arrangements down, and then that would lead to rehearsal. They got to rehearse because you're not going to rehearse before you record. And then there's going to be further arrangement, either by the Beatles themselves or by George Martin. And then now it's time to record the song and then mix it down. All of that had to get done in 30 days. And the reason why they had to wrap up by November 11th of 1965 is because they needed to get Rubber Soul on the shelves in retail by December 3rd of 1965 in time for the Christmas season. Any Beatle record at that time brought in a lot of revenue to the company. So when I listened to this presentation by Scott Fryman, I got about 15, 20 minutes in, and I said, this didn't happen. I've been writing songs since the late 1970s. I'm a guitar player. I've been in and out of studios. And I said, there's no way that they wrote from scratch 16 songs in 30 days and recorded them. It was 14 songs for the album and 2 songs for a double A-side single, which was We Can Work It Out and Day Tripper. And if you take a look at the timeline throughout October and November, the Beatles are just cranking these songs out like it's widgets on a manufacturing line. Songwriting is a process, and it's not just about writing the music. You also have to come up with the lyrics. So a lot of people just want to believe it was magical. The music and the lyrics just fell out of the sky, landed in their laps, and that's how it worked. And you know, the reasoning that, well, it could be done because they were the Beatles is ridiculous, quite frankly.
It's circular. It's a bit circular, and it does raise the question. I wonder if you consider this, like, because if this was an engineered project, and your thesis basically that they were given the songs and all the rest of it, why have an official narrative that does raise these questions, unless it is to try and cement the idea that they're super geniuses? I mean, is that
Yeah.
would that be a way to explain it? Because it definitely does raise a question. Oh my God, they wrote 16 songs in 30 days under the gun. That's incredible. They must be geniuses, because the other alternative wouldn't even occur to people.
Yeah. The Beatles are portrayed as supernatural, a supernatural force. They're geniuses. They can do things that no mortal songwriter or musician can do. That's the story.
Right. So it's very convenient. It sort of has a double function, because it covers up the truth, but it also generates the myth.
Yeah, and it's hitting people at an emotional level, because people love these types of stories. Who doesn't love the Beatles' official narrative? I loved it, the Cinderella story.
Convincing as, you touch on this, but as personalities, they're incredibly convincing as something. Like now we think that's what geniuses are like so charismatic and funny and blah, blah, blah. But actually, maybe it's more like the Monkees. They were fantastic performers.
The Beatles were performers. Now, the other thing too, Jason, some people want to argue with me and say, well, they did have some songs when they came into the Rubber Soul sessions. They had 2 or 3 songs, but that's not true either. So what happened was that when they came in, the official narrative tells us that they had partials of We Can Work It Out and Michelle. Now, if you have a partial song, you still have to complete the writing of the song. I have a lot of partial songs. So if I brought it into a studio, I say, okay, well, I've got a little something here, but now I've got to complete it. I have to fill it out. There was another song, What Goes On, and the official narrative tells us that that was brought in from very early on. It's claimed that John wrote that song in 1959, but the official narrative tells us that the only thing that they kept from that song is the chorus. Everything else was revamped and rewritten. So it wasn't the song from 1959. It's a different song that happened to retain the original chorus. And then we're told that they brought the song Wait in from the Help sessions, which took place earlier in the year. But even Wait wasn't a completed song. They still had to come in and they had to do overdubs, vocal overdubs and some other overdubs. And I think they did that on the very last day on November 11th. In fact, they completed 4 songs on November 11th of 1965, which is just crazy within itself. So the problem with Rubber Soul, what I tell people is if you don't like the number 16, pick a number. 10, 12, 14, pick a number. In Mark Lewison's book, Mark is considered to be the expert on Beatles history. In one of his books, and I have it here, he said that for the Rubber Soul sessions, the Beatles had to write from scratch more than a dozen songs. Now, what does more than a dozen mean? It means 13, 14, 15, or 16 songs. In a Beatles monthly magazine going back to 1965, October of 1965, it's an official Beatles magazine, Paul McCartney was asked about the Rubber Soul sessions, and he said they don't have anything up their sleeve right now. The cupboard's bare. That's going back to 65, and we're talking about biological Paul McCartney. We're not talking about Billy. So where we can settle with this thing is they essentially came in, like Scott Fryman said, essentially empty. And again, if somebody wants to argue they had 2 songs, 3 songs, knock yourself out. Because I don't care if they had to write 12 or 14 songs. It's still a lot of music to write from scratch in 30 days.
This wasn't the Beatles. This wouldn't be unusual, right? It wouldn't be unusual for a band that was being marketed, that was becoming a big thing, to go into a studio and be given a bunch of songs, right? And studio musicians right? But they wouldn't have to fake it because it was no big deal, right? What I'm trying to suggest is that although the template that you're presenting for Rubber Soul is controversial for all the reasons you know, forward and backwards, it wasn't that unusual actually. Before or after, and if you look at the 90s with boy bands, this kind of thing just became normal.
It's always been like that. It goes back to Tin Pan Alley. It's always been like that. So when you think about it, the Beatles were really an exception to the rule.
Right.
And remember, I said that the Beatles were on the hook for 2 albums a year. So after the Help album was released, what happened? Did everybody go to sleep? Nobody was checking in with John and Paul. Hey guys, we've got another recording session in October for the Christmas season. We're going to need 16 songs, 14 for the album, 2 for a single. So Brian Epstein didn't reach out to them and say, how are we coming along? George Martin didn't ask Brian, or George Martin didn't go to the Beatles directly and say, how's it coming along? Because we've got a lot of music that we're going to be recording in October, and so I'm hoping you guys are progressing. What happened to the communications? No, what happens is they just show up with basically nothing. We should be asking questions is what I'm saying. And that's what I did. I started asking questions. Now, Paul McCartney, biological Paul McCartney, made 2 important comments. One in June of 1966 at the Hilton in Japan. And when the Beatles were asked about their musicianship, Paul McCartney said, we never said that we were great musicians. We're adequate. Okay. Now, he said this as they just finished up recording their 7th studio album, Revolver, which is the album after Rubber Soul. Then on August 5th of 1966, the BBC interviews John and Paul at Paul's home. And during that interview, Paul repeats what he said back earlier in Japan. He said that we are not great musicians. And he also said that they wrote their music in great big batches. Let's take the musicianship piece of it first. To be just an adequate musician and to plow through what they had to plow through in 30 days at Rubber Soul, it's not going to cut it. So we're told that they arrived in the studio, per Scott Fryman's presentation, on October 11th of 65, the very next day, the first day of recording.
You know what day that is? October 12th. It's Crowley's birthday.
Crowley's birthday, yes. So October 12th, they complete the recording of Run for Your Life. The second day in, on the 13th, Drive My Car is in the bag. On the fifth day, Day Tripper's knocked out. On the seventh day, If I Needed Someone is done. On October 21st, Norwegian Wood is in the bag. On October 22nd, they bang out two songs, In My Life and Nowhere Man. And 18 days in, We Can Work It Out. And then we have the same progression as we move through November. And it gets really weird in November because on the very last day, we're told they completed the recording of 4 songs on the very last day in one long session. I think it went like 12 to 13 hours. You Won't See Me and Girl, which according to the official narrative says that those songs didn't exist before November 11th, which means what? They wrote them that day and then they learned them, they rehearsed them, and then they recorded them. They finished Wait from the Help sessions. Remember, I said that they pulled that one in. They had to do some overdubs. And they finished up I'm Looking Through You. So 4 songs on the very last day. When you take a look at how this marches along, this is not reality. And what I explain to my audience, because I have a lot of musicians and songwriters, sound engineers, and some producers who follow my work, what we will say is for musicians and songwriters, sound engineers and producers who are honest and not looking to either want to believe the story under any circumstance. In other words, we're just going to defend the Beatles story because I like the story. Or they know the truth, but they won't speak the truth. Because if they speak the truth, especially if they're in the industry, it's pretty much the kiss of death. Because it would be heresy. And I've had people write me and say, look, Mike, I've got information for you. I'm going to share it, but please do not tell anybody, don't talk about where you got this information from. They don't want to be persona non grata in the music industry or Paul or kook, and then the work dries up. So, they'll steer clear of that. When we go through how these songs are banged out, Jason, in this amount of time, again, it's not reality. And we're told that not one of these songs took more than 5 takes. Not one song took more than 5 takes in the studio. Now, if we fast forward to the White Album sessions in 1968, and we take a look at the number of takes that the Beatles did for those songs, we're talking about dozens. 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70. I think there was 100 takes for Not Guilty, which is a George Harrison song that didn't make it onto the White Album. So how did they go from 5 takes with Rubber Soul, not exceeding 5 takes for any one song for the Rubber Soul sessions, to, in 1968, to dozens and dozens and dozens of takes for the songs on the White Album?
Your view is that with the later albums, they were doing some songwriting and becoming more actively involved.
Yeah. So my take on it is, my position, I concluded that from 1962 through 1966, the Beatles wrote little to nothing. The Beatles were too busy being the veneer, the performers, out on the world stage. They were doing nonstop touring, especially when they hit the United States, February of 1964 going forward. They were very busy the year prior in 1963 out in the UK. They were doing press conferences. They were doing promotions. They were on TV shows. They did 2 films. So we've got all of this activity taking place. In the Beatles documentary, The Complete Beatles, there's a segment in that documentary. Now, this was considered the Beatles documentary before Anthology was released in 1990. It explains that their touring was exhaustive. And so the narrative wants to tell us that 2 things. One, they'll say that it was exhaustive, and then they'll say that the Beatles were a perpetual writing machine. They were always writing. They were writing when they were on tour. They were writing on film sets. They were writing in the studio. They were writing when they were on holiday or vacation. They were writing all the time. Going back to the August 5th, 1966 interview that Paul McCartney and John Lennon did with the BBC, Paul McCartney, I'm talking about biological Paul McCartney, blew that out of the water. Paul said, we don't write in between albums. Then he pauses and he says, normally, he caught himself. He was going to say, we don't write in between albums, period. But then he said, we don't write in between albums normally. Maybe 1 or 2. We write in great big batches whenever we need to come in to do a record. And then the BBC interviewer says, I always thought it was quite impossible to write that many songs on the spot or in a short span of time. And John Lennon says it is sometimes. Sometimes it's quite impossible. And then both John and Paul go on to explain that for Revolver, because the interview took place the day that Revolver was released. They say, well, for the last album, it took us weeks to write just one song. Okay, well, if it took you weeks to write one song for Revolver, how did you write 12, 14, 16 songs for Rubber Soul in 30 days? How did you do that? So there's these types of inconsistencies in the story, and the Beatles themselves were dropping clues. They were dropping hints as to what was really going on. Now, the other problem with Rubber Soul, because some people still want to believe that because they were magical and brilliant, that they wrote all these songs in 30 days because they're the Beatles. The other problem with it is the manufacturing cycle time does not work. It does not work. And if you look at the Beatles' official narrative, they just skim right over that part of it. EMI cuts the final mono lacquer on November 17th. So the Beatles finish up recording. It's supposed to be November 11th, but it goes into the very early morning hours of November 12th. We're told that George Martin wraps up the final mixing on November 15th, and he completes the song sequencing on November 16th. Now, song sequencing is very, very important, and I'll get back to it in a moment. The next day, November 17th, we're told that the final mono lacquer was cut. Now, when the final lacquer is cut, that means you can start the pressing process. You can create the stampers and start pressing the vinyl. And so from the 17th of November to December 3rd, when the records ended up in retail, that's 2.5 weeks. So we're to believe that the entire manufacturing process took 2.5 weeks. And remember, back in the day, when we talk about distribution, there's no digital media. Everything's got to be staged and then loaded up on trucks and delivered out to the retail outlets. Back then, there were no big box stores. Everything was local record stores, retail outlets that were going to carry the records. So there was a lot of transportation that was taking place to get all of this stuff out, to get the records out. Now, I was working with somebody when I did my big presentation back in April of 2020, did the Beatles write all their own music, where I brought this to the forefront, who has been in the music business for a very long time and is very familiar with the vinyl pressing process. And he explained to me that back in the day, it was at a minimum 2 months from the time that the final lacquer is cut to when the album made its way out into retail. So in the case of the Beatles, the final lacquer was cut on November 17th. That means that we shouldn't have seen the record in stores until January 17th or later. It was explained to me that 8 weeks, could be 10 weeks. That was the cycle time. Why do you need that cycle time? You need that cycle time because you have to print. There's a couple of things you have to do. You have to print the center labels. You've got to print the album jackets, the labels and the jackets. The ink has to dry. Back in the day, they were using 4-color printing with the rollers. It took a week for the ink to dry before they could handle the slicks for the album covers. Everything has to be proofed, and then once everything's proofed and it's ready to go, it gets shipped out. The final product gets shipped out. Now, you can't do the labels, and you can't do the album jackets until the song sequencing is done, because the center labels and the back of the album jackets contain the names of the songs in sequenced order.
And the length of the songs. No?
Yes, the run times. Although I think Rubber Soul, because I have original copies, left off the run times from the original pressings. But the names of the songs in sequenced order. Now, if George Martin didn't finish up the sequencing until November 16th, how did all of those labels and all of those album jackets make their way to the pressing plant 24 hours later on November 17th? How did it happen? And here's the other problem that they have. The center labels for a vinyl record, whether it be a 33 RPM or a 45, they are adhered to the record at the exact same time that the album is pressed. It's not adhered to later, which means the labels had to be in-house, on standby, and ready for when the pressing process began. That did not take place within a 24-hour window of time. So what did happen? What happened was the Beatles didn't write any of those songs for Rubber Soul. Those songs were written by outside ghostwriters, and the instrumentation, the music, was recorded by studio musicians way beforehand, weeks, months in advance. Because it was done weeks and months in advance, once the songs were written and they were recorded without the vocals, George Martin now knew that he knew the names of the songs. After they did editing, they then had the final version of the instrumental track of the song, which means now they had the runtimes. So they had the names of the songs, they had the runtimes, and this allowed George Martin to do the sequencing. Now, the sequencing is important because it establishes the flow of the record. How many songs are on side A? How many songs are on side B? And by the way, the Beatles, aside from in the early days, with the exception of A Hard Day's Night, did 7 songs per side, 14 songs, 7 and 7. Goes back to Crowley or Crowley's book, 77.
777. 3 sevens.
And the 3 sevens. Triple sevens, yeah. So what happened was George Martin was able to start the printing process way before the Beatles ever arrived in the studio on October 11th of 1965. That process was well underway. So when the Beatles arrived, George Martin now has the instrumental tracks, and in all likelihood there were guide vocals so that the Beatles could learn the vocals and learn the harmonies. That's what they did for 30 days. The Beatles learned and then sang the vocals for the Rubber Soul album.
There's an in-between argument that the music was written and the titles were decided so that they could prepare all that, but the Beatles were given a little wiggle room to write a few lyrics.
No.
You consider that as no? That's not.
No. Look, see, here's the thing: to believe the Rubber Soul story, we would have to believe that EMI would have just winged it, based upon how the official narrative is presented to us. If you were an executive at EMI, Sir Joseph Lockwood, or if you were George Martin, you would say, we have a deliverable that has to be out in the stores by December 3rd of 65 in time for the Christmas season, and we're going to come into the studio and try to figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody in the record industry is going to fly by the seat of their pants like that. Because what could have happened and what would have happened if that were the case, if the official narrative were actually how it worked, no album would have been produced. And heads would have rolled at EMI Parlophone.
Mm.
A lot of folks just don't want to give up on the Beatles. Had something to do with the songs. They had to have had something to do with the songs. They had to.
Well, that's where I was going to go, because I've never been a major Beatles fan, but you say that you have been.
Yeah.
So what's it like for you now that you're convinced that you were completely wrong in the past? I don't know, do you still listen to the Beatles?
I can appreciate the craftsmanship behind the music because it was a lot of very well-written music, regardless of who wrote it.
Yeah, but do you still experience a cognitive dissonance now when you listen to those early songs? And because presumably what we would have to extrapolate from this version of things is that the John Lennon personality, or the Paul McCartney personality, which is less formed, I think, that seems to be coming through those early songs, wasn't, right? Because he didn't write like the lyrics or the music. But the way that we've grown up on the Beatles is that there were these two personalities, right, and that had different styles. And even though it said Lennon and McCartney wrote everything, which is an interesting clue in itself that they had that, they imposed some false reality in a way that everybody knows, because they didn't write them separately, or even in the official version. But anyway, this sense of John Lennon's personality evolving through the music, clearly, by your interpretation, is false. So what's it like when you listen back? Because there are some of those early songs that do seem like John Lennon finding his sensibility, right? Or did.
It's John Lennon playing out a script. When we did the analysis back in April of 2020, again, I had a person on the team that is very accomplished. He went back and listened to the early music. We're talking about the period between 62 and 66. And he said to me, Mike, I've studied this, and what I'm hearing is two distinct styles, songwriting styles. What I deducted was that there were two teams. In all likelihood, two very small teams of maybe 2 to 3 songwriters that were responsible for writing McCartney types of music, style of music, and another 2 or 3 songwriters that were responsible for writing John Lennon-style songs. So that's how you get the distinction. Now, the narratives around, well, this sounds like John finding himself. This sounds like John really liking Bob Dylan and this and that. We hear all of these stories.
Mm-hmm.
They're stories. They're just stories. What people know about the Beatles, because nobody knows them personally, aside from the people who are in the inner circle, I'm talking about the fan base.
Yeah.
They have gathered and assimilated from documentaries, from books, from magazines, from all kinds of stories that are out there. So when they tell us this is Paul McCartney evolving or John Lennon evolving, well, how do you know that? You don't know them. You weren't with them when they were kids, when they were teenagers, when they were the Beatles. You didn't have lunch with them. You didn't have dinner with them. You didn't go drinking with them. You didn't go smoking with them. You didn't do any of that stuff with them. You only know what you think you know because you have consumed the official narrative. Mm-hmm. It's a gigantic story. Now, are there elements of truth in the official narrative? Of course, there's going to be threads of truth. But what I have found, the threads of truth are the things that don't mean a whole lot. Paul McCartney arrived at EMI Studios on this day. Is that true? Yeah. He showed up on that day at EMI Studios. That's the facade. That's the veneer. I'm talking about, we're getting into like the deep stuff. What's really going on behind the curtain? And you know this, Jason. What they do is they give the Joe Q public, they give them the official narrative. They give them the story. And people believe it. For all the folks that are into the conspiracy research and taking a look into the truth and all that stuff, and you understand that many aspects of our reality is controlled, why wouldn't the biggest band in the world, why would they have not been controlled? Why is it that you would believe that 4 working class guys out of Liverpool, by their own admission, were mediocre musicians at best when they arrived in Hamburg, that they showed no songwriting prowess? How is it that they got to achieve what they achieved, the trajectory? How did that happen? Because they were organic? No. There was a machine behind them. That's how it took place. The Beatles arrived in Hamburg in August of 1960. They were there for 4 months. It didn't go anywhere. But they were doing what young guys do. They were drinking, popping a couple of pills, playing on stage for 7 hours a night, hanging out with the ladies. They were enjoying themselves. They were 4 young guys doing what young men do, especially when they're away from home and there's no supervision. They're just going to go do what young guys do. And then in 1961, beginning in January 1961, this band that didn't prove themselves, not great musicians, no signs of any songwriting ability, all of a sudden they start getting all of these gigs virtually every day, locally within Liverpool and outside of Liverpool. Well, how are they getting all these gigs? They're not that great a band. Who's signing them? Who's telling them, yeah, come on in and play? Then on January 1st of 1962, this band that has no track record, they walk into Decca Records to do an audition. How'd that happen? And then in February of 1962, Brian Epstein takes the tapes to George Martin. George Martin says, nope, not going to sign them. Based upon what you're showing me, I'm not interested. Now they've been rejected by Decca. Now they've been rejected by EMI Parlophone. And then miraculously, in March of 1962, the BBC picks them up. The Live at the BBC gigs begin, which runs from March of 1962 out into 1965. Well, how did they get on the BBC? Decca turned them down. EMI turned them down. They've got nothing behind them. In fact, George Martin, in a number of interviews, but one in particular, said that even though the Beatles had nothing behind them, he liked them. They had charisma. That's what it was all about. It was about stage presence. It was about performance. They were a veneer for what they were going to become. The machine put them out front and built this whole backstory. Their job was to make their strategy come to life. Then in February 7th of 1964, they're in the United States. And the tagline was, the Beatles conquer America. Conquer America. So from the time they arrived in Hamburg in August of 1960 to the day they landed in America on February 7th of 1964 was only 3.5 years. Mm-hmm. Rockets on their shoes. We have to ask the question, how did that happen? I don't care how talented you might think somebody is. I don't care how great a musician you think somebody is. That is an incredible rate and pace. And my argument is that it was not organic. It was not natural. There was a massive machine behind them that was pushing them along because there was a massive agenda that they were going to be involved in. And they were the first manufactured band with the responsibility of social engineering at a worldwide level.
Well, that is the counter narrative, and as I said, I'm like Mulder. I want to believe it because there's so much evidence, but I want it to make sense and be coherent. And so it's helpful talking to you. And we were talking about how much resistance you encounter to this narrative, and I think that it's, in a way, I mean, this can be a bit circular, but in a way that's kind of evidence of how effective it's been, because I think what is suggested by this counter narrative is, as we just said, they were the first manufactured band. So I guess before the Beatles, it really wasn't a big deal if a band wrote its own music or its own songs. This whole idea that a band was supposed to be a bunch of not just charismatic figures, but geniuses.
Right.
That came about with the Beatles, I think, right? Because Elvis didn't write his own songs, and nobody cared about that, right? So even a single singer, Bob Dylan was probably the beginning of the songwriter myth as well. Maybe I'll have to bust him next. But anyway, that it's decades since then, and of course, since the Beatles, we don't know how many of the bands that came after the Beatles, not counting the Monkees, were manufactured, and we don't know how much it was an effective sort of mimetic thing where bands did become more and more, aspiring to become the way that they thought the Beatles were. But the fact is that decades later, that is the model that people were born into and grew up with.
And that other bands and singers and songwriters and artists emulated.
Yeah.
So that's the other thing that the question they'll ask me, are you saying that nobody writes their own music? No, I never said that. The Beatles were put out there as a template. And in order to get it going, the machine had to build it, had to build a foundation, build a house, sell them, market them, and push them, push, to make them larger than life. And they succeeded. They made them larger than life. And then what happened was they created an entire genre of music. And other bands came along, and there was a process of emulation. An emulation of the sound, an emulation of the lyrics, an emulation of the theme of the music, issues that were being pushed. Let's face it, human beings, they emulate, they mirror. It worked for the Beatles. Look how successful they are. We should do the same thing, or something very simple. Mm-hmm. And I will argue, and I have argued, that the entire British invasion, that's why it's called a British invasion, coming out of Britain, masterminded by the Tavistock Institute, which had ties back to the Frankfurt School, was a creation of the, for lack of a better term, the deep state, Tavistock included. And I believe that the powers that be are responsible for all of the genres of music that are pushed into the mainstream pop arena. There are indie artists out there. I'm not talking about indie. I'm an indie artist. But if you got signed to a major label and you're getting airplay and you're on TV shows and you're doing halftime shows at Super Bowls and that sort of thing, Taylor Swift is another one. Taylor Swift is a later iteration of what the Beatles were all about. And she has her entire cult of followers that they call the Swifties. Also, Tavistock gave the tagline to the Beatles, like what they call it, Beatlemania. Beatlemania. What is a mania? Mania is to hype up, to make excitable. Words have meaning. These slogans that they put out there. Frankfurt School was huge on slogans. People love slogans. They repeat them. So just put some simple words out there in slogans, and people will carry that to the bank.
So, I mean, there's two areas here for me. One is what we've mostly been talking about, which is the Beatles and the ways in which they were manufactured. We've covered quite a lot of that, and then there's a lot more that we could get into or that people can follow on their own. And intuitively and even rationally and logically, it's very compelling. And it doesn't have to be a complete reframing. There's room there for nuance and whatnot, but a largely manufactured cultural phenomenon. Yeah, got no problem with that. On the other hand, we've got the Tavistock Institute. There's another Tavistock, whatever, and then there's the Frankfurt School. And there's some literature about them, or not very much about the Tavistock. There's certainly plenty of conspiracy theory around that, and I'm using conspiracy theory in the sort of profane sense, as in a bit too much speculation, let's say. how solid is the connection between these two narratives? The one that social engineering is being done by something that includes the Tavistock and Frankfurt, because it definitely extends beyond those two groups, and the other being the Beatles. How strong is the connecting evidence between the two?
Again, it's circumstantial evidence, because you're not going to see any document out of Tavistock that's going to say, we manufactured the Beatles. We're just not going to see that. It's a deep state operation. The question I pose to people who ask this question, because I've been asked these questions many times, do you believe, and I'm talking to you, Jason, because I know you know this, but to the audience, that social engineering takes place? Do you believe that there's gaslighting? Do you believe that there's deception? Do you believe that people are lying to you? Do you believe the 9/11 official narrative?
Yeah, well, I mean, you say you're not talking to me, but even if you're talking to my listeners, I mean, you would be getting the answers that would encourage you, because I've got a very small audience, and mostly, although some of them are falling for the Trump style, mostly they seem pretty discerning. But I am genuinely skeptical about the link to Tavistock, not because I find it improbable, but just because I found there's a lot of stuff about Tavistock that I think is iffy. So, for example, when I was writing Vice of Kings, which is about sociocultural engineering in Britain, it goes all the way back to Crowley, but mainly I focus on the 60s. Well, the Fabian Society, actually, and then the 60s and 70s, right? I kept coming across Tavistock through ordinary sources. So at that point, I go, okay, there definitely is something going on with the Tavistock. But then when I went to the conspiratorial sources like Trine Day and Danny Estlin, I didn't find it nearly as useful. I thought there was just too much presumption and speculation and confabulation. So I definitely got this impression that there's a reality about the Tavistock, but then there's this narrative that's been generated, maybe well-intentioned or maybe not, that it's a bit like David Icke with the reptilians, right? There's really a lot of good information, but then it all gets wrapped up in this package with reptilians, and you're like, well, maybe, but how the hell do I verify that? So that's my skepticism about Tavistock connected to the Beatles. It's not that I find it implausible. It's just that when people make claims that aren't just based on evidence, then I think they're slipping down.
What entities do you believe are responsible for the social engineering and the mass mind control that's taking place across the world, and has been for at least 100 years if we use a timeline of modern time? Who's doing it?
Well, I certainly don't think that anyone can or should try to answer that as conclusively, but certainly one can name certain groups. So yeah, I'm saying the Tavistock certainly seem to involve, whereas the Fabian Society have a historical timeline.
Yes.
You can follow it through legitimate quote unquote sources. It's a bit ironic because you're going to the legitimate sources knowing that they're part of the deception, but somehow I find it's easier to stay on solid ground by just reading what's reported in the papers than going to these independent presses that do tend to join dots prematurely. But anyway, to answer your question, the Fabian Society is definitely one major player.
Absolutely.
Account for foreign relations, no doubt at all, and so on. But as far as actually who did what, I guess I don't really try too hard to, because as you said, if it's conspiracy, it's going to be secret. But I look at individuals and what they say and the things they've introduced, like Havelock Ellis was an early sexologist who introduced the idea that sexual perversity was an expression of individuality.
Right.
And then, okay, so that was right there at the beginning of the Fabian Society, and you can see it emerging in the 60s through other figures like Kinsey. So you see these trends that are developing, and you see some of the same suspects appearing in some of the same groups. And as I say, Tavistock was one of them. But in terms of specifically what a given group is trying to do, unless it's Fabian Society who actually are right out in the open. I mean, Tavistock, they were out in the open recently because they're transgender. They got all the pushback.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. So they're not so marginal now.
Well, and they did originate out of Wellington House, which was the propaganda arm for the British military during World War One.
Right.
If we look into the background of John Rawling Rees.
So, but is because there's certainly some evidence, as I say, for sexual liberation or pushing these agendas, but I haven't found in different groups and individuals, I haven't looked that hard for evidence of using pop music or popular culture. I mean, movies I've covered more extensively. There's quite a lot of evidence with movies. So have you found any really outstanding figures or papers? Actually, I did find a little bit about music in the 40s, because they were pushing dance halls in the 40s, and songs for war propaganda in Britain. So something like that, that's like, aha, they're obviously interested, and that's completely documented. So have you found things like that that are a bit closer to your thesis?
Are you saying that you haven't found any evidence that music is involved in social engineering?
In the 60s, I mean, I should say I found no evidence, because I haven't looked very hard, and I wasn't looking specifically, but I say I definitely found evidence in the 40s during World War II that was going on in Britain, that they saw popular music as a propaganda tool, no doubt about it. So yeah, I can easily extrapolate. Okay, so they continued in the 50s and 60s. Of course, I believe that. I'm just curious if you found anything really meaty around that.
Well, I mean, meaty would be the psychedelic
Yeah,
era, that whole genre. That's probably the most obvious, I mean, to me, and I would hope that most people would see that as
yeah,
something that's obvious. But what I try to do, Jason, is to have people take a look at what was going on in pop music going back, let's say 1960. We have the Everly Brothers.
yeah,
Well, let's just take from 1960 to 1969, 9 years, we have Woodstock. Pop music went from Bill Haley and the Comets and the Righteous Brothers to Woodstock in less than 10 years. Was that natural? Was that organic? Marilyn Ferguson wrote a book called The Aquarian Conspiracy,
yeah,
and she was tied into Willis Harman,
yeah.
who was a social scientist going back to the human potential movement in the 1960s. In fact, Woodstock was referred to as an Aquarian exhibit. It was all a setup to the age of Aquarius. It was all a setup to Crowley's Aeon of Horus. All table setting for that. That's what I concluded.
Yeah,
The Frankfurt School itself, through Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, these guys talked about the use of the media, radio and music, and then obviously later on it became television, to manipulate the masses, to shift their way of thinking and their values. In fact, Horkheimer, who was a main player with the Frankfurt School, said the revolution won't happen with guns. Rather, it will happen incrementally, year by year, generation by generation. We will gradually infiltrate their educational institutions and their political offices, transforming them slowly into Marxist entities as we move towards universal egalitarianism. Now, universal egalitarianism is a nice way of saying communism, Marxism. You talked about the Council of Foreign Relations. We can go to the Trilateral Commission. We could take a look at the World Economic Forum in current day, because a lot of people are familiar with them. And we can clearly see that they're laying out their strategy. They're clearly laying out their plans. I mean, they've written, Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote about the technocratic society. And my point is that all of these internationalist organizations, and Tavistock being a part of it, it's a horizontal that's all stitched together. They have a master plan, and that master plan is to implement a one world, new world order. So if somebody says, well, I'm not so sure about Tavistock, but be sure about one thing. Be sure that there is a hidden hand. There are controllers. There is a control system that is manipulating reality and manipulating your societies and your cultures.
yeah. No. I mean, I've never had any doubt about that. My concern is that part of their manipulation is I don't like to use the word they, but it involves providing us with narratives about what they're up to as well. Right? They're that cunning.
Well, the narratives are very difficult to cut through. They really are. As an example, if you go to Tavistock, it looks like motherhood and apple pie.
Have you been to Tavistock?
I mean, to their website.
Oh, the website.
If you read their website, it's motherhood and apple pie. Now, are they motherhood and apple pie? I sincerely doubt it. I've had this discussion before with others, and some people want to say, well, you need to prove that Tavistock. I don't have to prove anything.
No, I'm not saying you need to prove it. I'm just curious what you found. For example, Theodor Adorno, he wrote a book, Making of the Counterculture, didn't he? Was it called that?
Yeah.
I'm wondering whether I should spend money on it. I mean, have you read that? Did you find any very useful?
I've read stuff on Theodor Adorno, going back especially 5 years ago when I was doing the big presentation. But Adorno his big thing was critical theory. There are victims and there are oppressors. But really what it was gaslighting. Critical theory really was to criticize the current societal norms, to break them down, to break down the family nucleus, as an example. One of the Frankfurt School's strategies was to break down the traditional family structure. And they did that by saying to the woman, the wife, the mother, why do you do what you do? Do you really want to stay home and watch the kids and take care of the house? And a lot of the women would say, yeah, that's my role as a mom, as a wife, as a woman. But why do you do them? Are you doing it because somebody told you to do it? Is something that you just grabbed onto because that's the way it's always been? Why don't you think differently? Why don't you go out to work? Why don't you go do what your husband's doing? Don't you want to do that? Don't you want to be independent? You really want to be reliant on your husband coming home and keeping a roof over your head? I mean, this is the type of strategy. These are the type of tactics that they used.
Yeah, for sure.
And they then started to destroy the family apparatus. So when I say before, I don't have to prove, what I'm saying is everybody needs to do their own research into this thing. I did my research and I feel comfortable with where I landed with this. I feel comfortable with what I believe Tavistock was involved in. There has to be, from a logic perspective, there has to be a focal point. There has to be a hub responsible for social engineering, because it's no different than a corporation. The deep state, whatever you want to call them, is structured. It's a pyramid structure. It's the exact same structure as a corporation. So if you work for a large corporation, there's going to be a function or a department that's responsible for strategy. There's going to be a department or a function that's responsible for marketing and sales. There's going to be a function or an organization responsible for research and development. There has to be a function within this control system that is responsible for the social engineering. Can it reach out into other functions like the Club of Rome, out to the CFR, out to the Trilaterals, out to the Bilderbergers? Of course. As George Carlin said, it's one big club and we're not in it. So I hope I answered your question. I really do. And I hope you don't mind me being very frank and straightforward, because you're asking a lot of questions, very good questions, that I haven't had the opportunity to answer in an interview. This is a good opportunity for me to be able to talk about this stuff. But your questions are very good, and I really appreciate you asking them.
Yeah, well, you're welcome. I'm trying to get to the bottom of something myself. And I haven't looked much into the Beatles. I just wasn't sure, is there a there or not? But I'm looking into that period of history because the period that I was born into and grew up with. So my curiosity's kind of been tweaked by that or stimulated. So yeah, my skepticism is the skepticism of somebody who just wants to get to the bottom of it, not somebody who's trying to dismiss it. I think we know that. You touched on something in one of the interviews that I listened to that I want to get to, which is the why of it, the why of the Beatles, the deeper why. And but before I get to that, I want to ask you if you're familiar with the term parasocial relations. Are you familiar with that?
I've heard the term.
Yeah, so parasocial relations are what we're talking about. They're to do with celebrity culture, whereby it's a one-way relationship. You think that you know this person, but they don't know who you are. Right.
That's what I was talking about with the Beatles.
Exactly. You were specifically talking about that. The people think they know the truth about the Beatles because they think that they've got this personal relationship to them. And that, of course, is what intensifies the emotional investment. They're actually defending something that they think is as if it's their own family members or something like that. So they've been pulled into this illusory matrix, let's say, a magical mystery tour. And I would say this is very central to the social engineering project of the Beatles, I think there was a growing awareness around this phenomenon of parasocial relating, and that the mass media was, of course, making the social engineering groups aware of this, and then figuring out ways to optimize, what it could do, how it could be used to manipulate. And that the Beatles were, one of the leading experiments in this, and the ways to create a much more parasocial kind of realm of celebrity culture and hero worship and all that. So, but my question is, or something that you mentioned about what it's all about in terms of creating this counterculture, this popular culture that people get more and more invested in, and it replaces the other meaningful connections that they would have in their lives. I think you mentioned it has something to do with the ancestors and our traditions. So
Yes.
I'd like to talk about that because I think that that's a deeper layer that mostly doesn't get talked about.
What the control system has delivered to us, Jason, is pop culture. And I have described pop culture as homogenized idiocracy. It's a dumbing down across the board, and people have lost touch with their ancestral and traditional values, their heritage. As an example, when I was growing up, my mom is Italian. My father was Irish Welsh, but our house was very Italian as far as how mom ran the family with dinners and get-togethers and all of that. So we had an understanding of what it was like to have that type of tradition in our home. And the French have their tradition, the Germans, the Mexicans, the British, they all have their traditions. But the controllers had to get rid of those traditions or the attachment to those values because they were obstacles. So to make things really easy and to set the table so that they can clear the decks and they can move forward with their agenda, they handed everybody over years and years and years of stuff that was on the radio, on television, in music, in the entertainment industry, Hollywood, this pop culture, which has degraded to the point to where it's quite unbelievable with the smut. And if you take a look at these halftime shows and these awards shows that they televise with these pop artists, it's all ritualistic. You know, we go back to to France, and they had in the Olympics, they had that depiction of the Last Supper.
Yeah.
And it was a mockery of the Last Supper. And the French came back with a response that said, no, that was the cult of Dionysus. Had nothing to do with Christ and the Last Supper. It's the cult of Dionysus. And they actually came out and said this. So the cult of Dionysus is the cult of Pan. It's Luciferian. They have subverted so much from within. They are now far more overt about what they're doing and what they believe that they can say openly without receiving much pushback from the general public or the masses.
Yeah, I agree.
I explained that the Beatles were a tool of the cultural Marxists, and it was subversion from within. Did the Beatles have great songs? Yeah, they had great songs, but it was great songs with an agenda.
Yeah, well, this is a big question mark, isn't it? So I was just thinking while you're talking, I'm sure you've had this experience. You start watching a TV show, assuming you do watch TV, and it starts out really good, but it gets perhaps shittier and shittier. But if you got sufficiently hooked by the first show, you'll just keep watching, even though it's getting worse and worse, right? You notice that. I started to think it's deliberate. I mean, obviously they want to hook you. That's deliberate. But I mean that it's deliberate that it gets shittier and shittier because they want to lower our standards. My feeling, right? So it's like this with across the decades since the Beatles. They started out with something that really looked good at the time, and even when you look back, it looks good. But we can see where it's got us to. So somehow that's the proof. The proof is in the pudding, as they say, right? So, I mean, that doesn't mean necessarily you blame the Beatles. They're just a tool anyway. But it does raise the question of, I mean, it seems so insidious and vicious, really. But I mean, maybe this is Satan's game, right? He's got to put on a good show. But does it puzzle you that the social engineers who seem to be so organized in their malevolence and so anti-life could create something that seems so positive and inspiring as those Beatles songs, like that they would actually even have the ability to do that?
They have the ability to do it, and they do it all the time. So they always present a good face, a happy face. Everything's always positive. Everything is always presented as a benefit to us.
Sure, but it often isn't, and they're just lying. But in this case, I suppose it's not that strange, is it? Because they just found good songwriters who didn't know they were working for whoever, right? They just thought they were expressing their abilities.
They had songwriters that were very good at their craft, but it was all being steered. Like you said, did the songwriters themselves actually know, what it is that they were contributing toward? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But above them, there were people that were steering the ship. There were social scientists that were directing how things were going to go and in what direction. Going back to the TV shows, The other thing that they do is the normalization of the police state and surveillance. They always put the CIA, the MI6, they always put the FBI, and all of these other agencies like the intelligence agencies in a good light. They always present it as surveillance is good because without surveillance, we wouldn't catch the bad guy. See, so cameras on every street corner with facial recognition is an excellent idea. You don't have to worry because you're not committing any crimes. But those who are bad better beware because we're going to catch them. So people are like, yeah, that sounds good to me. I'm not going to commit any crimes. Yeah, so put as many cameras as you'd like. But the thing is, that's not the truth. So what they want is a total surveillance lockdown. And that's how they set the table in movies and television and other media to get people on board, to get them bought in. And many times the buying in is not the person buying in actively. It's passive. They just let it happen.
Yeah, I think it's probably the most insidious thing is that it does foster a kind of passivity, even if it's good art. I mean, I'm thinking of something like The Godfather, but you see, you have a film industry that clearly was set up as an arm of propaganda from the start, but certainly became overtly that in the last few decades. And yet they produce things that seem like they are positive works of art. But there's two ways of looking at that, I think. One is that a propaganda arm has to have the prestige that generates the trust of its recipients so that we actually turn to it to get, right? That's one fact. And the other is that even a work of art can be a Trojan horse for something. So The Godfather, although I think it's a brilliant movie, does kind of glamorize the mafia. And apparently all the heads of mafia approved it. Apparently, if that's true, I could certainly believe that. So I think one of the problems I've been looking at in my work is that we've kind of lost the discernment to evaluate what's good for our souls and what is not good for our souls because our taste has been shaped by the very culture that we're defending, right? So the Beatles, yeah, it seemed like good music and it seemed innocent now, but that's partly because actually that music shaped our criteria for judging, for evaluating.
Yes, so it was counterculture, it was anti-establishment, but it was put across in a way that was very appealing to the young people. And I have explained that the Beatles were foundational to all of the genres that followed. So what, quote, they did, the controllers, what they did was to create other genres of music that appeal to certain segments of the population in order to bring them on board, in order to get them to embrace a different path, a different societal landscape. As an example, the punk movement in the 1970s.
Mm-hmm.
That was another one. If you look up the word punk in the dictionary, it's somebody who's an outlier, is an outcast. That's the label that was given to that music. And it caught a big segment of the youth and brought them in. It's the same thing with grunge. It's the same thing with metal and also hip hop and rap. I concluded that when we take a look at pop, and I'm talking about pop music, okay, pop music. I'm not talking about indie artists and the such. Anything that's in the mainstream, any genre of music that's in the mainstream and being pushed, is being pushed because it's pushing an agenda. And a lot of times it's subtle, but there are other times when it's not. When we talk about rap music as an example, I mean, it became very derogatory toward women. Many rap artists, I'm not even going to say borderline, were leaning into criminal activity in the songs. So they start here, they start simple, and then they just keep building and building and building. Think of it as like the rungs on a ladder. First rung, second rung is the Beatles, the British invasion. Then we go to the third rung, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and so on, and keep moving it forward. Our reality is controlled to an extent that most people can't even begin to comprehend. And if I bring it back to my Beatles work, which I retired back in November, thank God, because I'll tell you what, it was 8 years of just grinding it out, and I didn't receive a lot of Christmas cards. You know, they played a big part. They played a big part in that whole counterculture and getting the ball moving.
Yeah.
With the Beatles, you have to set aside what it is you have been told, because everything we know about the Beatles we have been told through narratives. and just start with a clean sheet of paper. I'm not asking people to agree with me 100% because that's not my intent. With my work, I've always said I'm not here to convince anybody of anything. I like researching, and then I enjoyed presenting my findings. That's it. If you agree with me, great. If you don't agree with me, great. Everybody has to land in their own place. But to believe that these four guys, working class guys out of Liverpool, did not have a machine behind them, a massive machine behind them. If you're thinking that way, I would ask people to rethink because they were massive. Anytime you watch a documentary about the Beatles or some write-up about the Beatles, what do they always say? They were a cultural phenomenon. They changed culture.
Yeah.
Nobody ever says, well, they were marginal. Nobody ever says that. They always push the point about how important they were to social change. Always.
Do you find it frustrating to watch documentaries about Beatles, or just generally to be exposed to the official narrative? Does it still bug you, or are you now?
No, I mean, I don't even watch them anymore. I just skip over them because once in a while I might click on one just to see what nonsense is being pushed, but it's the same old stuff. It's the regurgitation of the official narrative. It's funny. I'm not going to name any names or any channels, but there's one channel, and it is a very big pro-Beatles channel. When I came out with my presentation back in April of 2020, and I honed in on Rubber Soul, later on, this channel went to present their version of Rubber Soul, but all they did was to reiterate the official narrative. They never stepped forth to say, and they don't even have to mention me by name. Everybody will know who it is anyway. They never said, well, this is how they did 16 songs in 30 days. Let me show you. Let me give you the receipts. Let me show you how it was done. No, that's not there. It's not there. It's not there because it's not there. They never explain how it is that all of the labels and the album jackets got printed within 24 hours after the song sequencing was completed. They don't touch it. So what they do is it's a game of avoidance. They just run around it because they know that most people don't want to hear Mike and Mike's story. They don't want to hear Mike talk about how the soundtrack to most people's lives as Beatle fans and Beatle freaks is something that needs to be questioned, that it may not be entirely true. Nobody wants to hear that.
You just remind me of another data point that I wanted to mention because it seems so substantial, which was it after Revolver or Rubber Soul that they toured and they didn't play any songs on the album?
It's Revolver.
And so is the official explanation for that they were very elaborate, sophisticated songs and they couldn't play them live? Is that the official explanation?
Yeah, that it required too much orchestration, the effects on the used on the albums or whatever couldn't be done. But there are songs on Revolver
that you could strip down.
That could have been stripped down and played. I mean, you couldn't play Taxman.
Yeah, so that's bizarre. That's a really bizarre.
So that's bizarre. And the reason why, my opinion, no songs from the Revolver album. Some people want to say, well, they played Paperback Writer. Paperback Writer we're told, was recorded during the Revolver sessions, but Paperback Writer was not on the album. The reason why the songs weren't played is because the Beatles didn't know how to play the songs. They weren't taught the songs to play. The Beatles' job was to come in and sing the songs, the same way the Monkees did. The only difference is with the Monkees, the story was up front.
Well, I was going to bring up the Monkees actually. We're going to wind up soon, but what do you think about the Monkees? Was that a revelation of the method or what? Now, in the context of the Beatles, it does seem quite striking that they decided to do a show that pretty much showed what might have happened with the Beatles.
Yeah, I think that was intentional, and in the book and other researchers, even outside of the Memoirs of Billy Shears, will say that they believe Paul McCartney died September 11th, 1966. September 12th of 1966 is when the Monkees' debut television show premiered. Now, the other thing, too, is that there was an interview done by a magazine out in Australia called Ram Magazine. I forgot the name of the interviewer, but it actually goes back to New Music Express, which was a music publication in the day. Yeah. And an interview with Phil Spector in 1976. And in that interview, Phil Spector claims that he was involved with the Beatles before the making of the album Let It Be. That he went back in time with the Beatles, that he was always there behind the scenes. And during that interview, because the interviewer was having a hard time believing him because nobody had heard this story before. And then Phil Spector says to the interviewer, was I not on the airplane when they landed at JFK Airport in the United States on February 7th, 1964? Was I not on that plane? And the interviewer says, yeah, you were. So Spector claims that he was very involved with the Beatles. Now, he doesn't say he produced them, but he says he was involved with them. So what does that mean? I'll give you some speculation, and I think I'm probably pretty close. Phil Spector's house band was the Wrecking Crew out of LA. The Wrecking Crew was responsible for most of the instrumentals behind the pop music in the 1960s and 1970s here in the United States. And I also believe it went across the pond over into the UK. That makes sense to me because based upon what I concluded that the songs were recorded by studio musicians, then that means it's possible that Phil Spector was behind the scenes responsible for getting those songs recorded, or at least some of those songs recorded. And that's not to say that there weren't studio musicians out in the UK doing their thing on Beatle music as well. But based upon that interview, at least from my perspective, I have to think in terms of perhaps the Wrecking Crew and Phil Spector was involved in the recording of the Beatles' music during the early period. I get comments and they'll say, oh, Phil Spector, he was a crazy guy, and Phil Spector was wound up in jail for murdering shooting the actress back in the early 2000s. I said, that's true. Phil was an egomaniac, there's no question about it. He was a little off kilter, but that's not to take away from the fact that he was an extremely successful producer in his day.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of crazy people that are good at their jobs, Jason. So that in itself, you can't just discount something because somebody did something later on, 30 years later.
There's more credibility, really, because he was such a weird character. He was obviously involved in weird stuff. No doubt about that. Shadowy kind of figure. What do you think of supposed George Harrison deathbed thing? Is there anything in that about Paul is dead?
The Last Testament of George Harrison? Yeah, it's not George on the in the documentary. It's somebody, it's a
hoax.
It's a hoax, but it's a hoax that is telling some truth as well. I haven't watched it in a long time. I actually have the DVD going back many years ago. But I don't put a lot of stock into it. Some people will say that all of my research comes out of the Memoirs of Billy Shears, and that's absolutely 100% false. The Memoirs of Billy Shears was a stepping stone for me. It's something that struck my curiosity, and then I went outside of the Memoirs of Billy Shears to do further research to investigate whether what was said in the book was true or not. So when the book talks about the Beatles as an entity being immersed in the occult, I went and took a look. What did I find? I found lots of evidence that the Beatles as an entity were immersed in the occult. The whole bit about whether they wrote their music or not and played on all of their recorded tracks, that was me. It wasn't in the book. It wound up in the book later on in footnotes after I released my work, but that was not in the book. So, and the book will say that he played the character of Vivian Stanshall in the Bonzo Dog Band. When I read that, did I take that at face value? No, I didn't even believe it. But then I went and took a look. And one of the most compelling pieces of evidence is to take a look at Vivian Stanshall and the Bonzos and take a look at Paul McCartney's son, James McCartney. They look like father and son. James McCartney's resemblance to the Stanshall character, which was Billy before the transformation into what became Paul McCartney, is uncanny. Now, is it direct DNA proof that James McCartney is the son of the guy that played Vivian Stanshall? No. But we have to also apply our own perception, our own ability to critically think and to observe, and to look at two people and say, boy, they look a lot alike. What I'm trying to explain is my work looked at the book said certain things. I said, I don't know about that. And then I went outside the book, did my research, and I said, okay, well, yeah, I think this is probably true.
Is there anything that's really substantial that indicates it really is an insider rather than somebody who's just done what you've done and really dug deep and come up with a compendium of evidence?
I think it's an insider. I'll give you a quick story. Going back a number of years ago, there was a passage in the book that had to do with Billy Shears being involved with the Diplomats, which was a band that Denny Lane was in back in the day in the early 1960s. And I read that passage, and no matter how many times I read it, Jason, I was thinking, what is this passage saying? It could mean this, it could mean that. So I reached out to Tom. I sent him an email, and I said, I read this passage a number of times, and I'm not really sure what it's saying. It could mean this, it could mean that. He said, well, Mike, it's written that way intentionally. Again, there's that piece of the book which is coy, and it's asking the person in a very subtle way to dig deeper. But I asked the question, I forgot what the question was, but it had to do with the character of Phil Ackrell in the band of the Diplomats. Tom said to me, Mike, I have to go back to the files that were sent to me. You know, I didn't react to that. I was in an email. I thought to myself, the files that were sent to you. So that sounded to me like he was receiving source information, and his job was to pull that source information together and to pull the book together.
For sure, or he wanted you to think that.
Well, I mean, we could say that. We can go back and forth with all that stuff. But here's the thing. We can't pick one thing and say, oh, he's playing with you. He's toying with you. He wants you to think a certain way. I was outside of Tom. Tom didn't tell me what he was working on. I never told him what I was working on. I went out and did my own thing. And when I looked at the book and I started to piece it together and connect the dots, things fell in place for me.
So it was helpful, yeah.
It was helpful. Now, there's no question that the book is encoded. There's no question about that. Anybody who has read the book, with the word stacking, the acrostical code, and later on other encoding that went into the book, like the whisper messages. Tom told me, again, in an email going back a number of years ago, that he was taught to encode at an early age. Now, how early, I don't know. He was taught this skill. And the way the Masons work is they will teach these skills with the person not understanding at the time why they're learning these skills. It's very compartmentalized. And then later on, down the road, that person can be tapped to apply those skills to a project. And that's what happened with Tom. The Memoirs of Billy Shears is a Masonic book. It's a big puzzle. And it's presented that way intentionally. And if you're intrepid enough and you have it interests you enough, and I'm talking to the audience, then you will read it and you will dig deeper into the narrative. That's my story, Jason, with regard to the book and how my work got started. But the book was a stepping stone for me. I haven't gone back to that book in a long time. What happened was I reached a certain point and then I was just looking at stuff on my own.
Yeah. Maybe I'll revisit the book at some point. Maybe I'll feel I have to, but I just got a kind of unpleasant feeling off it overall. Something about it, a whiff of salt thing. And I don't like secrecy of any kind, including, you know, even if there's a need for the secrecy in this case, I still don't like it because it's kind of a mind game. So as I'm talking to you, I can see you, I can hear your story, I can gauge, you know, there's a personal connection there. So I just felt it was a bit of a trap in that book potentially, but maybe there's a trap in everything.
Well, look, there's a trap in just about everything. There's a trap in just about everything that we're presented. We talked about the entertainment industry and the music industry and these films and these movies and the messages they have embedded in them. I have mentioned to my audience many times that the book can be very dark. For me, getting through the book and doing the work that I did was very helpful to me because I have a much broader, better understanding, I believe, on how this world operates based upon that book. So it was beneficial to my education. I'm a lot smarter now than I was 8 or 9 years ago as to how things work because of that book. Because quite honestly, I mean, I heard of the occult and I watched some videos on the occult and stuff like that. But it wasn't until I got into that book that I started to really dig in and understand a lot more about how they operate.
Because I was immersed in the occult from childhood on, really looking back with hindsight. So maybe that's it. You know, I've got oversensitivity to it and want to keep my distance.
What's your take on Aleister Crowley? Just
really, really bad. I mean, I was influenced by him. I read him quite young in my 20s, and I took on the Book of the Law and tattoos. And I never became a Crowleyite per se, because I was never a joiner. I would never become a Thelemite. But nonetheless, like you with the Beatles, or me with, the David Bowie or something, I really took on Crowley's message and his meanings and identified with him and internalized the writing. And then in my 40s, I started to look into my own past, and simultaneously, I guess I was looking into Crowley. And what I found was that there was a double bluff around Crowley when he wrote passages about sacrificing children, and then later said, ha, that was a joke, and all the stupid Christians fell for it. I was just talking about masturbating. Well, if you read those passages carefully and you put them in the whole context of a book about magic and theory and practice, when he's talking about, and if you look at the Book of the Law, the best blood is the blood of a child, and it's a double bluff, right? So I began, like yourself, with the Beatles. I looked for evidence, looked harder and harder for the evidence that he actually was involved in child sacrifice and child sex with children, and I just found a lot of it. And again, as you say, with conspiracies, it goes double when there's sexual abuse of children or ritual sacrifice. None of it's advertised or broadcast.
No.
But I juxtaposed Crowley with Jimmy Savile, you've probably heard about now in Britain. He was 6 decades a predator of children, and he bragged about it on TV. He made jokes about it, but everybody thought it must be a joke because he wouldn't. So this is part of the method of these sorts of individuals. So I think Crowley was signaling for two different audiences. One for the masses, that he wanted to become this popular figure, and thanks to the Beatles, he eventually did become, partly thanks to the Beatles. The other was for those who are closer to it, being insiders or genuinely aspiring to become a sorcerers, occultists, who would take him literally. And it's really clear, at the very least, if he believed he was the magus of the new aeon and that his books would become like holy books, you don't make jokes about sacrificing children knowing that people will take it literally, unless you basically think it's all right to sacrifice children, right? So the kind of double thing you've probably found with Beatles fans that Thelemites and Crowley defendants have around Crowley itself is evidence of how they've been gaslit by the exposure to him. So it's very pernicious, I would say, to anyone. Just don't read Crowley, just stay the hell away from it.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because that's exactly where I landed with him.
Right.
I get people that want to argue with me. That his age of Horus, his eon of Horus, is going to be an age of illumination and enlightenment for everybody. I'm like, I don't think so.
No, just for the few, and a terrible price for the rest, I think.
Yeah, he says in Book 77, and the slaves shall serve.
Yeah, well, that's Book of the Law, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I had an insight talking to you today, so we're going to wind up, but I just thought I'd share it around the Beatles, and it's this, that it was about the ancestors, that, because my father never liked the Beatles, and he made fun of Elvis, and I was thinking today, well, that's probably pretty common for kids who grew up and they liked the Beatles, that their parents didn't like them, and in fact, they would have liked the Beatles more because their parents didn't like them.
Right.
And something about that whole cult of the Beatles and rock and roll that created a divide between parents and children, and it seemed to be a good thing. And so it occurred to me that, that's very much what you're talking about as the psyop, central to psyop, but that's also, it's a very deep rift that's being created between us and our ancestors that we can actually see in the present between, a child and their parents, right? They think that rebelling against their parents is good, and maybe it is to some degree, to become autonomous. But to the extent it was taken in the 60s, taking on these values that the parents rejected, and largely correctly, we can see now that we're older now, right? Sex, drugs, and rock and roll are not good values. It's like we got cut off from the whole ancestral line, like, an incision or an axe blow just severed that. Because of course, none of our ancestors, going, further back we go, the more true this is, would have had any sense of rock and roll, right? So the things that we're, our values are actually not consistent with the values that we need to hold in order to connect to our whole ancestry and be really rooted.
And if we fast forward to today, there's so much dysfunction. I don't even know how we dig out.
No.
I hate to say things like that because I want to be upbeat, but when I look around and I see what's still being played on the television and what people still believe and what they talk about, I get disheartened sometimes, Jason. I think, man.
Yeah. Well, I don't have children. I have a niece, and she seems relatively sane. And I do think I think the generation that have come after us, they are mostly doomed in terms of just being born into this toxic environment where they just can't tell any difference between themselves and it. So they're imbued with it. But there does seem to be a very small proportional percentage that actually have greater discernment than you or I did when we were their age, I think.
Yeah.
So I guess that's where and anyway, there's always, I mean, I don't know what a deist is exactly, but maybe if I did, I would say that's what I am. But certainly to me, the Spirit, even the Holy Spirit, although I'm not a Christian, what makes it what it is that it's in everything. Like it's actually everywhere if you look closely enough, even in Tavistock Beatles songs, right?
Right.
So in that sense, no matter how bad it gets, we can't ever actually lose our connection to what is going to see us through. We can think that we have. That's why it frustrates me when people put their hope in someone like Trump, right, or any big figures, because it means they're not looking where they're actually going to find the thing that will save them.
That's exactly right. People want a savior. They want somebody that's going to look after them, pick up after them. I hate to say this, but it's almost a childlike mentality.
Yeah, it is. Well, it's what a desire to be powerful as well. And children want to be powerful because they have difficult circumstances that they dream of being superheroes or Beatles. And then a figure like Trump or Musk is basically like the superhero figure that they want to be on his team. They're not looking out for our interests.
No, not at all. Not at all. I call it the rebranding of the New World Order. That's really what's going on right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we thought it was going to look like this, but as soon as we've identified it, a new skin suit, a new psyop, and
I mean, as soon as he came in, he talked about Project Stargate.
I know.
$500 billion investment, AI, and guess what? We're going to have vaccines, shots that are going to cure your cancer in 2 days or something.
And how is that not enough for people who believed in Trump? How is that not enough to say, wait a minute?
Right.
No.
I don't know.
I don't know either, Mike. Yeah, it can be lonely being among the very few who can see through the illusion, but it's better than joining the herd that's heading for the cliff edge.
I'd rather be alone, sitting with the truth, Jason, than being part of the herd and just believing the deception, living the lies. I walked off that ship a long, long time ago.
Well, yeah, me too. Me too. But you do have some instruments there, so I guess you need at least enough people that you can jam with.
Yes, well, I've been doing music a long, long time, so it's what I enjoy. It's what I love to do.
Yeah. Well, I'll link to your Bandcamp. I didn't take the time to listen, but I will after today. But if you like, when I put this up, I can link to it. And,
yeah, I appreciate that. Or my SoundCloud site.
Because the only music I listen to, well, not quite true, but mostly that I listen to, and certainly the only music I put in the podcast is like Bandcamp or free music. It has to be music that nobody's heard of. That's my rule of thumb.
Okay. Yeah.
So you're included in there.
Thank you. Relatively speaking, that's true.
Yeah, well, you said it. I mean, if it's made it into even close to the mainstream, then it must have been deemed useful to diabolic agendas.
I really appreciate the interview, Jason. It was a very good line of questioning. As I mentioned earlier, you asked a lot of questions that I don't get on a lot of interviews, and it gave me the opportunity to discuss it at a broader range, and also to dispel a lot of commentary that's made about me and my work that is simply not true. Sometimes that could be frustrating because people will say things, say, oh, Mike said this, Mike believes that, and I'm reading this comment, I'm thinking, I never said that, and I don't believe that. So where were you getting your information from?
Yeah, I know. I straw man all the time.
Yeah.
Have you spoken to this what's he called? Black Sheep Boomer? Have you spoken to that guy?
I have not. I have not done a lot of podcasting as a host in a while.
You know who I mean? That guy.
Yeah, the Black Sheep Boomer YouTube channel.
Yeah.
I've watched a number of his presentations. I think he does a good job. One of the ones that I thought was very good was where he showed that there were more than one Paul McCartney in A Hard Day's Night in the movie.
Wow, I haven't seen that. But
Yeah, I thought that was very good. He called out some, I thought, some pretty compelling evidence. But generally speaking, I don't watch a lot of other Beatles or Paul is Dead channels. I really never did. Even the 8 years where I was doing the research, I would occasionally watch something if somebody sent me a link and said, hey, Mike, you might be interested in this particular interview by somebody who's talking about the Beatles and Paul is Dead. I'm like, oh, okay, so I'll take a look at it. But I was way too involved in my own research, which was occupying a huge piece of my life, Jason, probably too much of my life. And that's why I stepped out last November. I said to my wife, I said, I'm not doing this anymore. I've said all I can say, and now it's a point of diminishing returns. And I don't want to do it just for the sake of doing it or to repeat myself or for it to become conspiratainment.
Yeah.
And that's how a lot of people look at it. A lot of people look at it as entertainment.
So were the Beatles your white whale then? Was that it? I mean, are you gonna carry on fishing, or what's after your retirement?
I'm just going to go back basically to doing what I started doing back in 2011 or 2012 as a blogger and running my blog. I don't have any intentions of looking into any other band, right, or John Lennon or George Harrison or Ringo Starr. I get asked that all the time, or the Rolling Stones. I have no intentions of doing that. What I tell people is I hit the pinnacle. I covered the Beatles. I investigated the Beatles. So you can just take those findings and just take them and apply it to another band. Is it going to map exactly? Maybe not, but most of it will. So just take that information, and if you're interested, if somebody wants to look into the Rolling Stones, well, take the initiative and look into the Stones. And if you want to apply some of what I found with the Beatles to whatever it is you want to look at, then, that's great. But no, I don't have any other plans of looking into any big topic like I just did with the Beatles. It's exhaustive. It really is. And it takes away from your personal life. It takes away from your family life. My wife and I, we have 2 grandchildren now. So we want to spend time with the grandkids, quite honestly. And I'm in the middle of a big music project that's going to take me out through the end of this year. And I want to finish that project. And my wife and I just want to get a couple of other things done in our life because we're both in our 60s. And so this is behind me now. I'm not doing any more research on it. If something comes up that's important, Billy dies or something, then I'll talk about that. But I'm not digging into it anymore like I used to.
Yeah. Not going to go looking for it. Just hope it doesn't come looking for you.
Yeah.
Might get a call from Fall.
Yeah, no, that's, people ask me about that. It's not going to happen. I have nothing to do with him, and I'm not working with Tom or any of that stuff. I'm not a Freemason. I'm not in the Illuminati. These are all things that people have made accusations about me. None of that stuff is true. I'm just Mike. I'm just a guy that came from a blue-collar family, was a Beatle freak, and I fell into this in 2016. That's it. And stepped out in 2024.
Right, well, I'm glad my timing was this good, actually, because I only heard about you a few weeks ago, because I was just raising this question, I suppose, and I don't know why it took me so long to think. I should really find out if there's anything there. But so my timing was good. I'm glad I caught you in this post-retirement, but still willing to talk about it stage.
And if you have any questions, Jason, at any time, feel free to email me, and I'll do my best to answer them. And I don't have all of the answers. That's the other thing. I don't claim to have all of the answers. No. So when I'm speculating or I have a hypothesis, I will say I'm speculating and this is a hypothesis. I'm very clear about that. I tell people when it's my opinion, this is my opinion. This is what I think. This is what I believe. People can make up their own minds. I'm not here to convince them.
All right. Well, so one last question then. How many Paul McCartneys do you think there have been?
As far as primary, 2. There was biological Paul, and then Billy has the permanent contract, but there were others that paged in and out. Now, the book tells us that there were others that played the part. So there were doubles and lookalikes that were put into play since day one. That's why it's so difficult to do the image comparisons, because there were doubles and lookalikes. That is not hard to see. All you need to do is to build yourself a collage, go on the internet, download Paul McCartney images, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, into the 2000s or whatever, and just line them all up. And you're going to be able to see that these are different people, or more than just two different people, 3 or 4, because you're looking at doubles and lookalikes. Also, quickly before we leave, there was, back in 2009, Wired Italia, which is the Italian version of Wired magazine, published an article where 2 forensic experts out of Italy,
I saw the YouTube about this. Yeah.
they dug into the whole conspiracy. And they dug in because they thought that Paul was always Paul, and that they were going to finally put this silly conspiracy to rest. And then what happened was, as they started looking at the forensics, shape of the face, the teeth, and all that stuff, they found that they're not the same person. And the more they dug and the more they looked, the more convincing and the more uncomfortable it became for them. Because now they were in a position where they had to come forth and say, we don't believe it's the same guy.
Right.
And so what happened was, when that article came out, it did come out, and it's very difficult to find. I have a copy of it. I could send it to you if you'd like.
In Italian.
I have the Italian version, and I also have a website that summarized the findings. I can send you both. It was at that time that Shears, Billy, playing the role of Paul McCartney, went on the David Letterman show here in the United States. And they talked about the Paul is Dead conspiracy. And he was, they were both joking about it to downplay it. And Billy was doing his masterfully speaking. I'll paraphrase here, but he was talking to David Letterman and said, yeah, there's a very good double. And that would be me. So, but he was making a joke of it. And the audience, of course, was just laughing and thinking how clever and witty and funny he was. But what he was really telling everybody is, yeah, I'm the very good double. I'm the guy that replaced him. So, and he did that in order to get in front of the Wired magazine article that was published in Italy, squash it as much as he could by that appearance on Letterman, because clearly the Letterman show was going to get a lot more exposure than this article in Wired magazine in Italy. So that's another piece of information there that a lot of people probably don't know about, that there were forensic experts that looked at it, and their conclusion was that there were 2 different people based upon the 2 individuals that they looked at.
Yeah, it was good enough for me, but I was already open to it. But I sent it to a younger guy, and he was just, sorry, DNA is not enough. So, as you said today, people are going to believe what they want to believe.
There are DNA stories too, Billy. He did get caught up in a DNA issue.
Yeah, I read about that. I guess.
And also his fingerprints didn't match when he was arrested in 1980 in Japan, because Interpol had Paul McCartney's fingerprints from an incident in Hamburg where he and Pete Best started a fire near one of the clubs, and they were arrested, fingerprinted, and then kicked out of Germany. So when Billy got arrested in Japan in 1980, he was in jail for 9 days. Fingerprints didn't match. And this is explained in the book too. So the Japanese authorities were asking him who he was, because he's an imposter. So he thought he had a big problem at that time. And what he explains is the British government ultimately intervened and got him cut loose, and that was that.
Yeah, don't worry. It's not a problem. We know what's going on here.
He's our guy. So,
will it ever come out, Mike?
Well, what I tell people is it's already out. He went to the effort of putting the book out. You got to read it. You got to break it down. You got to decode it. It's a lot of work. Yeah, it's a lot of work, but he did it. Is he or anybody else ever going to stand in front of a podium in the mass media and say, hey, I'm not Paul McCartney? That's never going to happen. It's never going to happen.
Like the UFO's landing, isn't it? Promises, but never happen.
It's never going to happen. That's what they do. They just continue to lead people on. It's like with the moon landings. We'll go back to the moon.
If they ever went there.
Yeah. It's like Elon Musk saying, we're going to inhabit Mars. It's never going to happen. They want people to live in that bubble of illusion. Evidently, people love to consume it. They love to consume that stuff. I call it the cartoon world. Yeah. We live in a comic book.
The virtual carrot.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you for your time.
You're welcome, Jason.
I'll put this up in a week. I'll explain it in the email. But anyway, it'll be up in about a week. So
Okay.
be in touch about it.
All righty. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time. And again, thank you for the questions. They were great.
Thanks, Mike.
All right. Bye-bye now.